They threw me out like I was nothing, right there in front of everyone. "This house is only for people of class," she said, while my husband just stood there and watched. "Hi, I'm Olivia. I thought I married for love. Turns out I was just another pawn in their game. But here's what they didn't know. I was never the one who needed them. They needed me. And when I turned to security and said, 'Escort them out,' their faces were priceless. What would you do if the people you trusted most betrayed you? Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated? Let's talk about it." This house is only for people of class. Margaret Harrington's voice rang through the summer air, each syllable dipped in ice. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood frozen on the grand marble steps of her Hamptons estate, the very place I had spent years trying to fit into, believing I had built a life here. But as I looked into her cold, amused eyes, I knew the truth. I had never belonged. The guests around us sipped champagne, their gazes flickering toward me, watching, waiting. No one stepped forward. No one objected. Then the final blow came. William, my husband, the man who once whispered promises of forever, stood beside her. He didn't protest. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he pulled a neatly folded set of papers from his tuxedo pocket and held them out. "Sign these," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's for the best." My breath caught in my throat. I looked down at the crisp, official-looking documents. Divorce papers. I felt the heat of humiliation crawl up my skin, the sting of betrayal sinking into my bones. This wasn't just an impulsive act of cruelty. It was premeditated. Margaret's smirk widened as she stepped closer. "You see, dear," she purred, her voice thick with condescension, "a woman like you, someone without proper breeding, without legacy, was never meant to last here. This family needs a future, and well, you're nothing more than a mistake William has now corrected." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eyes widened. Smiles were hidden behind raised glasses of champagne. Some were openly delighted by the scandal unfolding before them. My hands clenched at my sides. I had loved this man. I had trusted him. And now he was disposing of me like an accessory that no longer suited his taste. I could have cried. I could have begged. That's what they expected. That's what women like me, the ones who weren't born into wealth but fought tooth and nail to earn it, were supposed to do. Instead, I did something that no one, least of all William or his mother, saw coming. I laughed. It bubbled out of me unexpectedly, cold, bitter, full of something dangerous. Margaret's smile faltered. William frowned. "What's so funny?" he snapped. I tilted my head, studying him like a stranger. "The way you just followed orders like a good little boy. Did Mommy tell you to get rid of me? Or did she bribe you with another trust fund?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he recovered quickly, shaking his head. "Olivia, don't make a scene." "A scene?" I repeated, taking a step forward. My heels clicked against the marble, the sound slicing through the hushed whispers around us. I turned, facing the crowd. "Isn't that what you wanted? A public execution? Let's make sure we get the full effect." I turned back to Margaret, whose expression was now carefully controlled, though I could see the faintest trace of unease in her eyes. "You've made one mistake," I said. "You assumed you had the power here." Margaret's lips curled. "And I don't?" I let the silence stretch, let anticipation coil tight around the room. Then I turned my gaze toward the estate's head of security, who stood near the entrance watching the scene unfold with a neutral expression. "Escort them out," I said calmly, my voice carrying over the estate grounds. The effect was instant. Margaret's face drained of color. William's mouth fell open. The murmurs turned into gasps. "What?" he sputtered. I gave a small shrug. "It's my estate. My name is on the deed, not yours, not your mother's. So, if anyone is leaving tonight, it's you." Margaret took a step forward, recovering quickly. "This is absurd. You're bluffing." I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. A few taps later, and the security system's ownership details were displayed clearly on the screen. I turned it toward her. There it was, my name. Margaret stared at it, her carefully Botoxed forehead creasing ever so slightly. William recovered next, straightening his shoulders. "Fine, you can have this house, but you're still out of this family, Olivia." I smiled. "That's the thing, William. I was never in it." The security team approached, waiting for my confirmation. I nodded once, and the lead guard stepped forward. "Sir, ma'am," he said smoothly, looking between them, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret's eyes blazed with fury. "You dare!" But William grabbed her arm, stopping her. His face was no longer just angry, it was afraid, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. I turned away from them, no longer interested in their protests. I had spent years trying to be accepted by these people, bending over backwards to prove myself, to be more, to be worthy. But now? Now I was done. As I made my way back inside, the murmurs of the crowd followed me, but I ignored them. The night air was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. An unknown number. I hesitated for only a second before opening the message. "You don't know the whole story. Meet me if you want the truth." My fingers tightened around the device. What truth? I looked back toward the estate's entrance, where security was still escorting William and Margaret off the premises. Their carefully curated world was crumbling, but something told me this wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. The Harringtons weren't just arrogant, they were frauds. I stared at the thick manila folder resting on the sleek mahogany desk in front of me. My fingers hovered over it, hesitant but burning with curiosity. The dim glow from the city skyline outside the office windows cast long shadows across the room, giving the air an ominous weight. Sitting across from me was Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had every reason to hate the Harringtons as much as I did. "Go on," she said, her voice measured but firm. "Take a look." I exhaled and flipped the folder open. At first, the documents didn't make sense. Birth certificates, bank records, land deeds. But then, like a puzzle snapping into place, I saw it. William Harrington wasn't William Harrington at all. His name was real, but his family history, a complete fabrication. My breath caught as I scanned through the pages. "Margaret lied about everything," Eleanor continued, watching me closely. "The wealth, the lineage, the entire Harrington legacy. It's all fake." I shook my head, struggling to process the information. "That doesn't make sense. The Harrington name is old money. It carries weight." Eleanor scoffed. "Because Margaret made sure it did. She married into a dying, disgraced family name and built it into something powerful, on a mountain of lies." I flipped another page. There it was, concrete proof, forged legal documents, shady offshore accounts, hidden financial transfers. The real Harringtons had lost their wealth decades ago. Margaret had reinvented the family from scratch, using stolen assets, fraudulent investments, and carefully cultivated connections. I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't just been betrayed, I had been used. It explained everything. Why Margaret had always looked at me like an outsider. Why she had been so desperate to get rid of me. I had always assumed it was because I hadn't been born into wealth, but now I saw the truth. She was afraid I'd figure them out. I closed the folder, pressing my fingers against my temple. "How did you get this?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. "I was engaged to William's uncle, years ago, before he mysteriously disappeared." I looked up sharply. "Disappeared?" "Oh, yes." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "The last person who got too close to their secrets ended up vanishing. Officially, a tragic accident. Unofficially." She tapped the folder. "You're looking at the reason why." A chill ran down my spine. Before I could respond, the office door creaked open and a hesitant voice broke the silence. "I shouldn't be here." I turned toward the doorway. Hannah Sinclair, the younger sister of William's new fiancé. She looked nervous, glancing around the dimly lit room as if she expected someone to jump out and grab her. Eleanor exhaled impatiently. "Relax. No one followed you." Hannah swallowed hard, still standing near the door, shifting uncomfortably in her expensive designer heels. If they find out I'm talking to you... I studied her carefully. Then why are you? She hesitated. Then, in a barely audible voice, she said, because I know things. And I don't think I can keep pretending I don't. I gestured toward the chair next to me. Then sit, talk. Hannah hesitated, but eventually lowered herself into the seat. She rubbed her arms as if trying to ward off a chill. They're planning something, she whispered. Margaret, William, my sister. She looked up at me, guilt flickering across her features. They think they've won. I arched a brow. Won what? William already threw me away like garbage. Margaret got her perfect, well-bred replacement. What else could they possibly want? Hannah hesitated. Your silence. I narrowed my eyes. She took a shaky breath and continued. They didn't just plan to humiliate you. They wanted to destroy you. Margaret was working with her lawyers, trying to get your assets frozen. They wanted to paint you as financially unstable, reckless. The plan was to make it look like you were the problem, so when the divorce went public, William would come out as the innocent victim, a devoted husband who had no choice but to leave his unstable, gold-digging wife. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. Eleanor muttered a curse under her breath. I overheard them talking, Hannah admitted, her voice shaking slightly. Margaret was furious when she realized you actually owned the estate. She thought it was William's name on the deed. That's why she acted so fast to kick you out. She panicked. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I had known Margaret was cruel, but I hadn't realized how far she was willing to go. Why are you telling me this? I asked, studying her. Hannah hesitated. Then finally she whispered, because I don't want to be like them. The room fell into silence. I exhaled slowly, gathering my thoughts. Then I turned to Eleanor. What happens if we expose them? Eleanor smirked. Their empire collapses. William's name loses all credibility. Margaret gets buried in lawsuits and fraud investigations. And trust me, she won't go down quietly. Hannah paled. She'll ruin you first. I met Eleanor's gaze across the desk. I could see the warning in her eyes. I thought of everything I had lost, everything they had taken from me. Then I smiled. Good, I said softly. Let her try. Eleanor studied me for a moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. I was hoping you'd say that. I glanced down at the folder again. My past with William had been a lie, but that didn't mean my future had to be. If they wanted to destroy me, I'd make sure I took them down with me. And the first step? Crashing William's engagement party. I should walk away, I should let karma handle them, but I won't. The skyline stretched before me, a glittering sea of lights reflecting off the penthouse windows. New York had been my battlefield long before I met William. I had clawed my way up from nothing, built my success without his name, without his connections. And yet, he had treated me like an accessory, a stepping stone, a stupid little investment. My fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey in my hand. Across the room, Eleanor paced near my desk, her sharp eyes flicking between me and the thick dossier she had laid out. If you're going to strike, it has to be now, she said, before they find a way to bury you. Hannah sat curled up on my couch, arms wrapped around herself. I can't believe William would actually do this to you, she murmured. I scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. Can't you? Hannah hesitated, then dropped her gaze. No, she admitted. I can believe it. I just didn't want to. I turned back to Eleanor. Tell me what you found. She pulled out her laptop, her nails clicking against the keyboard. I started digging into William's financials. What I found was... Well, let's just say it explains why he was so eager to secure that engagement with my dear Hannah's sister. Hannah's head snapped up. What do you mean? Eleanor spun the screen toward us. Insider trading, and not just small-time manipulation. We're talking millions. I leaned in, scanning the records displayed before me. William had been using privileged information from Harrington Corporation's board meetings to buy and sell stocks before market shifts. It was clean, calculated, and highly illegal, and now I had proof. I exhaled slowly. If we leak this... Eleanor nodded. His career is over. His reputation is in shambles. The SEC will come knocking. He'll be lucky if he avoids prison. I tapped my fingers against the desk, my mind racing. I had spent years playing nice, letting things go, taking the high road. But now? Now I was done being the bigger person. A sudden vibration on the desk made me flinch. My phone. A new notification. I clicked it open. A video. My stomach clenched. I pressed play. The screen flickered to life. And there he was. William. Sitting in a dimly lit cigar lounge, laughing with a group of men. Olivia? His voice was laced with mockery. She was a good investment. Stupid, but good. A useful stepping stone until I got what I really wanted. My breath caught. The video continued. She actually thought I married her for love? God, no. She had resources, connections. But once she outlived her purpose, well, you saw how easy that was. She's nothing now. The screen went black. Silence stretched between us. Then something inside me snapped. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. My pulse pounded in my ears, a mix of rage and something colder, more calculated. Eleanor watched me carefully. What do you want to do? I didn't hesitate. Leak it. Eleanor smiled. I thought you'd say that. She tapped a few keys on her laptop. Seconds later, the video was uploaded to a private account, set to release in 20 minutes. But I wasn't done. I turned to Hannah. Your family's planning a wedding, right? Hannah swallowed, nodding. I picked up my phone, dialing a contact. Then, let's give them something else to deal with. The next morning, the world exploded. Headlines blared across every financial news outlet. Harrington Air caught in insider trading scandal. Stocks plummet 38% overnight. Exclusive secret recording exposes William Harrington's betrayal of ex-wife Olivia Carter. SEC launches investigation into Harrington Corp. CEO scrambles to contain fallout. I stood by the window watching the sunrise with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages, calls, reporters begging for comments. But the only call I was waiting for finally came through. William. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was panicked. Olivia, what the hell did you do? I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch. Oh, William, I said, my tone almost amused. You didn't think I was just going to walk away, did you? You don't understand, he snapped. This isn't just about me. Do you have any idea what you've started? I smiled. Oh, I know exactly what I've started. He sucked in a sharp breath. You need to stop, now. I let out a soft chuckle. Or what? You'll sue me? You'll threaten me? He didn't respond immediately. Then, in a lower, more dangerous voice, he said, You have no idea what you're up against. I tilted my head. Neither do you. I ended the call, tossing my phone onto the couch. Eleanor grinned from across the room. I have to say, that was satisfying. Hannah, however, looked nervous. Margaret is going to lose it. I turned back toward the window, watching as the city woke up, unaware of the storm about to hit. Good, I murmured. Let her. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war, and I was just getting started. The wedding of the season, or the scandal of the century. I stepped out of the black town car, my heels clicking against the cobblestone driveway leading up to St. Augustine Cathedral, a grand, sprawling estate of a church that had been reserved for only the most elite of weddings. Today it was hosting William Harrington's second mistake. Soft orchestral music floated through the air, blending with the murmur of high society's finest. The guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, their hands holding champagne flutes as they whispered among themselves. They didn't know. Not yet. The media had gathered outside the gated entrance, snapping photos of every celebrity and billionaire who stepped onto the red carpet laid out on the church steps. A perfect wedding, a perfect bride, a perfect disaster waiting to happen. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress, sleek, black, and intentionally chosen to contrast against the pristine ivory of Vanessa Sinclair's wedding gown. I wasn't just here to watch, I was here to bury them. The vaulted ceilings arched high above the pews, sunlight streaming through stained glass, casting soft hues of gold and crimson onto the aisle. White roses lined the walkway, leading up to where William stood waiting. He looked proud, relaxed, smug even, like a man who thought he had won. Margaret sat in the first row, a queen presiding over her court. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her dress, her diamond earrings glinting under the warm glow of the chandeliers. Vanessa, his new bride, was a perfect picture of elegance. The press had fawned over her for weeks, a match made in high society heaven. And then the doors closed. The ceremony began. I waited. The priest spoke in reverence, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The guests settled in. Some reached for tissues, already dabbing at their eyes in anticipation of the vows. I watched as William took Vanessa's hands, his face carefully sculpted into an expression of love. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" William smiled, but before he could answer, a ripple of movement spread through the crowd. Phones buzzed, a whisper, then another. People shifted in their seats, brows furrowed as screens lit up with breaking news alerts. Then a gasp, another. I took a slow breath, savoring the moment. Margaret turned, sensing the shift in the room. She grabbed her phone, her expression tightening as she read the headline. Her perfectly rehearsed wedding was falling apart. William noticed it too. His fingers twitched against Vanessa's. Then, before anyone could react, the cathedral doors burst open. A collective gasp swept through the room. The music stopped, and the FBI walked in. The lead agent, James Calloway, strode purposefully down the aisle, his badge glinting under the chandeliers. A team of agents followed, their movements swift and calculated. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into full-blown panic. Margaret shot to her feet. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Calloway barely spared her a glance. His eyes were locked on William. "William Harrington," he announced, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "You're under arrest for insider trading, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice." William's face drained of color. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. The guests erupted, some whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. "No!" Margaret snarled, stepping forward, her polished veneer cracking. "There must be some mistake." Calloway didn't acknowledge her. He motioned to his team. 2 agents moved in. One grabbed William's arm. The other pulled handcuffs from his belt. The sound of metal clicking shut around William's wrists echoed through the cathedral. Margaret lunged forward. "You can't do this. Do you know who we are?" Calloway finally turned to face her. "Yes, ma'am." His gaze was ice cold. "And we'll be seeing you soon." Margaret froze. William panicked. He jerked against the agent's grip. "This is a mistake. I didn't—" His protests were drowned out by the flashing of cameras, the low hum of the guests realizing they were watching history being made. A Harrington downfall, a scandal of the century. The fairy tale was over. And I smiled. I stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The moment William's gaze locked onto mine, something flashed in his eyes. Realization. I tilted my head. I won. His lips parted, but no words came out. The press had already turned their cameras toward me, snapping the photo that would be plastered on every headline the next morning. Olivia Carter, the woman who took down the Harrington Empire. Outside, chaos erupted. Reporters shoved microphones toward guests. Socialites whispered behind lace-gloved hands. William was shoved into the back of a black FBI vehicle. His face was pale, his mouth moving, but no one cared what he had to say anymore. Margaret stood frozen on the cathedral steps, her expression unreadable. I watched her, And then, for the first time in our entire history, she met my eyes with something I had never seen before: fear. A slow, satisfied exhale left my lips, but then my phone buzzed. A new message. I glanced down, expecting more news alerts. Instead, what I saw made my stomach tighten. A single line of text: "Margaret has disappeared." I lifted my gaze back to the steps. Margaret was gone. This wasn't over. Not yet. The Harrington Empire was in ruins. William was in custody. Their name was a joke in high society. The headlines had gone from admiration to scandal, disgrace, financial collapse. But Margaret was still out there, and she had a secret of her own. I sat in the back of Eleanor's car, my fingers gripping the leather seat as the road stretched before us. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by rolling hills and dense trees. The further we drove, the more my pulse pounded in my ears. Because at the end of this road, in a secluded mansion far from prying eyes, I was about to meet the one person who could answer all my questions. The mother I thought was dead. The estate loomed in the darkness, a fortress of secrets and silence. The iron gates creaked as they opened, and Eleanor drove us up the long, winding driveway. I felt numb. How was I supposed to react? For 20 years, I had believed my mother was gone, that she had died in an accident when I was a child. But now? Now I was about to walk through the front door and see her alive. Eleanor parked. "You ready?" Number not even a little. I swallowed hard and stepped out of the car. The door to the mansion opened before I could knock, and there she was, Charlotte Carter. The woman I had only known through photographs and fading childhood memories. Her hair was streaked with gray now, but her eyes, my eyes, were the same, sharp, watchful. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then her voice, barely above a whisper, "Olivia." Something inside me cracked. I didn't move, didn't cry. I just stared at her. And then, just like that, she stepped aside, motioning for us to come in. The study smelled of old books and something faintly floral. A fireplace crackled in the corner, its warmth doing nothing to ease the cold inside me. Charlotte poured herself a glass of whiskey, her hands steady. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." Understatement of the century. I crossed my arms. "You think?" She sighed, setting the glass down. "I didn't die. I ran." The words sent a shockwave through me. My nails dug into my palms. "Why?" Her expression darkened. "Because Margaret wanted me dead." The air left my lungs. Eleanor tensed beside me, but I barely noticed. Charlotte continued, her voice tight. "Your father was investigating them. He got too close to something Margaret couldn't afford to have exposed. So she made sure he was dealt with." My stomach twisted. "You're telling me she had him killed?" Charlotte's silence was answer enough. I staggered back. I had known Margaret was ruthless. I had known she was a liar, a manipulator, a snake. But a murderer? Charlotte's expression softened as she looked at me. "He tried to protect you, and when I realized I was next, I had to make a choice. If I stayed, they would have killed me, and you would have been next." My breath hitched. The walls of my world, already cracked, began to crumble. For so many years, I had believed I had been abandoned. I had spent my entire childhood angry at her, mourning her, trying to understand why she left. And now I knew the truth. She hadn't left. She had been forced to disappear. I shook my head, tears burning behind my eyes. "You should have come back for me." Her face crumpled. "Olivia," she whispered, stepping closer, "if I had, you would have been next." I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to breathe, trying to process. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice carefully controlled. "If Margaret was willing to kill Olivia's father to protect her secrets, she won't stop now." Charlotte exhaled. "She never stopped. She's been watching you for years." I froze. "What?" Charlotte looked at me, something pained in her gaze. Did you really think she was just tolerating you while you were married to William? She was keeping you close, making sure you never looked too deep. A shudder rolled down my spine. The glances, the subtle warnings, the feeling of never quite being accepted. She hadn't just hated me. She had been afraid of me. Because if I had ever put the pieces together, I could have destroyed her. I lifted my chin. Well, now I know the truth. Charlotte watched me carefully. And what are you going to do with it? I met her gaze. I'm going to end this. Her lips parted, something like fear flickering across her face. Olivia, no. My voice was stronger now. She's done playing God. She's done controlling everything. I let her ruin my life once. Never again. Charlotte hesitated, then reached into the drawer of a nearby desk. She pulled out a single file, a document so damning it would destroy Margaret forever. She handed it to me, and as I stared down at the final nail in Margaret's coffin, my grief turned to fury. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice, and I wasn't going to wait for it. I was going to take it. Margaret thinks she's won. She has no idea she's already lost. I adjusted the lapels of my coat, my fingers cool against the silk fabric as I stepped out of the elevator. The penthouse at 1 Vanderbilt was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors, chandeliers that glowed like floating diamonds. Margaret Harrington's last stronghold. She had disappeared after the wedding disaster, vanishing into the shadows while William was dragged through the legal system. The world thought she was gone, but I knew better. Margaret was never gone. She was waiting, plotting, pulling strings, calling in favors. She still thought she could salvage the wreckage. She still thought she was untouchable. She was about to learn otherwise. The penthouse door swung open before I could knock. Margaret stood in the entryway, a vision of composed elegance. Cashmere sweater, diamond earrings, lips curled into an unreadable smile. She had been expecting me. "Olivia," she said smoothly, "I was wondering when you'd come." I stepped inside, my heels clicking against the polished floor. She gestured toward a crystal decanter on the bar cart. "Drink?" I ignored her. Instead, I took in the space. Minimalistic, refined, yet somehow empty. There were no family photos, no signs of home, just a cage she had built for herself. Margaret followed my gaze. "I assume you're here to gloat." I finally turned to her, letting my smirk form slowly. I'm here to end this." She laughed, low and dangerous. "Oh, darling, you think you've won just because my son is behind bars?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the last piece of evidence, the one she never saw coming. Margaret's eyes flickered to the file, and for the first time I saw it, a crack. "Go ahead," I said, tossing the folder onto the glass coffee table. "Take a look." She hesitated, but then, with practiced grace, she picked it up. She flipped through the pages, her calm facade still intact. Then she reached the last document. Her fingers stiffened. A single breath escaped her lips. Her face drained of color. I leaned in. "That's a signed affidavit, direct testimony from someone who used to work for you." She didn't blink. "Detailed records of your offshore accounts, the money you moved after William's arrest, the bribes you paid to keep your name out of the headlines." Her throat bobbed. "And," I continued, my voice quieter now, "proof that you were involved in my father's death." Margaret set the folder down, carefully, precisely. Then she lifted her gaze to mine, steely and unreadable. "You think this is enough to bring me down?" she asked. I smiled. "I think it's already done." And then, before she could draw her next breath, the penthouse doors burst open. FBI agents flooded the room. Margaret turned, eyes narrowing, but she didn't move. Not yet. Not Margaret Harrington. Agent Calloway, the same man who had taken William into custody, stepped forward. "Margaret Harrington," he announced, "you're under arrest for financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder." Margaret tilted her head. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said calmly. Calloway didn't blink. "Oh," I think we do." Margaret exhaled slowly. For the first time in her life, she had no way out. She had bribed, manipulated, and blackmailed her way through every crisis, but there was no deal left to be made. I watched as the agents moved toward her. Still, Margaret didn't flinch. She simply turned back to me. And then, as they pulled her hands behind her back, she smiled. A chill crawled up my spine. As they led her toward the door, she leaned in close. "You think this is over?" she whispered. I held my ground. She laughed softly. "You don't understand power," she murmured. "Not yet." And then they took her away. I exhaled, but for the first time I wondered, what if she was right? Some people fight for justice. Others fight to win. For the Harringtons, this wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about holding on to power. I knew that from the moment I stepped into the packed courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. Every major news outlet was here. Cameras clicked. Reporters whispered. For weeks, this had been the biggest case in the country, the fall of a dynasty. The Harrington name, once untouchable, was now synonymous with corruption. But they weren't going down without a fight. And I was ready. The courtroom was a spectacle. The judge sat high above us, her expression unreadable. The jury was tense, already overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case. And then there were them. William and Margaret, a mother and son clinging to their last shred of power. William looked worn down, his once perfect hair disheveled, the confidence drained from his face. His expensive suit didn't hide the exhaustion, the desperation. Margaret, on the other hand, was unshaken. She sat tall, her expression calm, calculated. She wasn't afraid, because she believed, no, she knew, that the right words, the right pressure, the right twist of the narrative could get her out of this. She had survived decades of deceit. She had crushed enemies before. In her mind, this courtroom was just another battle, and she never lost. Margaret's lawyers were vultures in tailored suits. They were strategic, brutal. They twisted every piece of evidence, painting me as a woman scorned, an opportunist seeking revenge. She infiltrated the Harrington family, one lawyer argued. She married into wealth, gained access to financial records, and then used them for her own personal vendetta. I didn't flinch. I let them talk, let them weave their lies, because when it was my turn, I would burn them to the ground. The bailiff called my name. I walked to the witness stand, my heels clicking against the polished floor. I sat, straightened my shoulders, took a breath. The prosecutor approached, nodding to me before turning to the jury. "Miss Carter," she began, "in your own words, can you tell us why we're here today?" I let the silence stretch. Then I looked directly at Margaret. "We're here," I said, my voice steady, "because Margaret Harrington believes she's above the law." Margaret's expression didn't change, but I saw it, a flicker, a shadow of something beneath the surface. "She orchestrated a web of corruption spanning decades," I continued. "She manipulated financial systems, blackmailed politicians, and eliminated anyone who threatened her power." The jury leaned in. I kept going. "She destroyed lives. She destroyed families, including mine." My fingers tightened on the wooden stand. "My father's death wasn't an accident. It was a warning." A ripple went through the courtroom. Margaret's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection." "Sustained," the judge said. "Miss Carter, stick to the facts." I nodded. "Fine, let's talk facts." I turned back to the prosecutor. She slid a file across the table. "Can you confirm this document?" I picked it up. It was the evidence my mother had given me. The financial records, the wire transfers, the signatures, every dirty secret Margaret thought she had buried. I held it up. "This," I said, "is proof that Margaret Harrington committed fraud, insider trading, and bribery at a scale that makes every other Wall Street scandal look like child's play." The jury gasped. I set the file down. "She lied," I continued, "for decades, and now she wants you to believe that she's the victim." I turned back to Margaret. She's not. Margaret met my gaze, expression unreadable, but her fingers curled slightly against the table. For the first time, I saw it. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Then came the moment that ended everything. The prosecutor called a surprise witness, a name not on any official list. Hannah Sinclair. A murmur rippled through the room. William snapped his head toward the door, and then she walked in. Hannah, his fiancée's younger sister, the girl who had been caught in the middle of this family's mess. Margaret's fingers tightened on the table. She knew what was coming. Hannah took the stand, her voice trembling at first, but then stronger as she spoke. I was raised to believe the Harringtons were royalty, she said, that they were untouchable. She turned her gaze to Margaret, but that was a lie. She pulled a flash drive from her pocket. I recorded everything. The courtroom went silent. The prosecutor took the drive, plugged it into the display system, and then the recording played. Margaret's voice filled the room. She's just a loose end. If she doesn't stop, we'll handle it, like we handled her father. I felt my breath leave my body. Margaret went still. For the first time in her life, she had no defense. The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed her gavel. Margaret's lawyers were panicked, scrambling, whispering to each other. But there was nothing left to salvage. Hannah had delivered the final blow. And I sat back. I watched as the empire crumbled. The trial lasted another 2 days, but the jury's decision, it took less than an hour. Guilty, on all charges. Margaret barely reacted as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison. William. He slumped forward, his entire body defeated. The press exploded. The courtroom cheered. Justice had been served. But as I sat there watching Margaret be led away, I felt something else. A shadow. A whisper of something unfinished. Because even as the doors closed behind her, I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't broken. She was waiting. And for the first time, I wondered, was this really over? Or was the real war just beginning? William and Margaret had fallen. But as I sat in my office watching the New York skyline stretch infinitely before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't over, not even close, because Margaret hadn't been running the game. She had just been a pawn, and now I was about to meet the man who moved the pieces. It was raining. A soft drizzle coated the streets, making the city shimmer under the glow of streetlights. I stepped out of the black SUV, Eleanor by my side. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. The skyscraper before us wasn't just any building. It was Montgomery Tower. Richard Montgomery. A name whispered in corridors of power. A man who didn't need headlines or camera flashes. He was the man behind the curtain, the real kingmaker. Margaret Harrington had been powerful, but he was something else entirely. I walked through the marble lobby, past the guards who didn't even bother to stop me. They already knew I was coming. I rode the elevator to the top floor, and when the doors slid open, he was waiting. Richard Montgomery was in his 60s, but there was nothing weak about him. His suit was impeccable. His posture? Commanding. The kind of man who had been at the top for so long he had forgotten what it was like to look up. He didn't offer me a seat. He simply gestured to the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. "The world looks different from up here, doesn't it?" I stepped forward, hands in my pockets, masking the storm inside me. "You don't strike me as a man who wastes time with small talk," I said. He smiled. "Fair enough." Then he turned to face me fully. "I admire what you did, Olivia," he said. "You played your cards well, took down the Harringtons in spectacular fashion." He tilted his head. "But I have to wonder, do you even understand the game you just walked into?" I felt my pulse quicken. "Enlighten me," I said smoothly. Montgomery stepped closer. "You think you exposed a corrupt family," he said, "but you barely scratched the surface?" I held his gaze. "And let me guess, you're the man holding the real power?" He chuckled. No, he said. I'm just one of many. A chill ran down my spine. I had expected a fight, a threat. But this was worse. This was a revelation. Montgomery walked to his desk, picked up a sealed envelope, and handed it to me. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a photo of my mother, Charlotte, taken this morning. A sharp inhale caught in my throat. "You're making a mistake, Olivia," Montgomery said. "If you keep pushing, you won't just lose your business. You'll lose your family." He spoke so casually, as if he were giving a weather report. I clenched my fists. "Are you threatening me?" He smiled again, slow, deliberate. "Number, I'm giving you a choice." He leaned against his desk. "You've proven yourself. You want to change the system? Fine. But understand this, the system isn't run by one person. It's built by men like me, like Margaret, like your father before he got too ambitious." My blood turned to ice. "What did you say?" Montgomery folded his arms. "Your father was brilliant, but he didn't understand one thing. Change comes at a cost." I exhaled slowly. "So what now?" I asked. "You expect me to just walk away?" Montgomery tilted his head. "No," he said. "I expect you to make a choice." Silence hung between us. "You can fight," he continued, "but you'll never win alone. Or you can join us, learn the real rules, take the power you've already built and make it work for you." He stepped closer. "We don't destroy people like you, Olivia. We recruit them." I couldn't breathe. This was it. The moment that would define the rest of my life. My father had fought the system, and he lost. I had fought the Harringtons, and I had won. But this was bigger than one family. I could walk away, take my victory, protect my mother, live a quiet life. Or I could fight, not just for myself, not just for revenge, but for something bigger. My father had died trying to change this world. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes. I was going to do it differently. I took a step back. Montgomery watched me carefully. "You're going to regret this," he said softly. I smiled. "No," I said. "You are." I walked out of that office knowing one thing for sure. Margaret had been a storm, but Richard Montgomery? He was a hurricane, and I had just declared war. Back in my office, I pulled out my father's journal. The last words he ever wrote stared back at me. "Kon gai, kon jasan sang je tai joy the gyoi chua." I exhaled. Then, slowly, I closed the book and picked up my phone. It was time to finish what he started, because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Looking back, I realize now, power isn't just about wealth or influence. It's about knowing who you are and refusing to let the world define you. For so long, I let others tell me where I belonged, what I deserved, who I should be. I played by their rules, hoping they would accept me. But the truth? You don't need their approval. You don't need to fit into their world. Because sometimes the world you're trying so hard to belong to isn't even worth it. I spent years thinking I needed validation from people who never saw my worth. But real power, real success, comes from knowing your own value, standing up for yourself, and building a life on your own terms. So if you're watching this right now and you've ever felt like an outsider, like you weren't good enough, like someone tried to take away your dignity, remember this. You are more than their opinions, more than their judgments, more than the limitations they place on you. And when the time comes, you will rise. But tell me, what do you think? Have you ever felt underestimated or looked down upon? How did you handle it? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And hey, if this video resonated with you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, hit that like button, drop a fire emoji in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't agree with me, that's okay too. Tell me why. I want to hear every perspective. Most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this again. Because trust me, this isn't the last one. Subscribe now. Your next story is just around the corner.